профессором Института философии Национального университета Цзинхуа в Тайване. Область научных интересов профессора относится к проблеме причинности, философским основаниям методологии экономической науки, поскольку магистерская диссертация была посвящена именно экономике, и философии науки, и широко, собственно, философии социальных наук. Ну и, соответственно, мы построим, наверное, по принципу доклад, вопросы, если будут какие-то реплики и так далее. И я предоставляю слово профессору. Please, you're welcome. Yeah. And if you could just speak to the mic, so because there will be a video translation of your talk, so we will need it to record the sound. Yeah. So you better sit down if you. Okay, thank you.
No sound.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank Elena's invitation to your prominent Institute of Philosophy. Yeah. Today's topic is that when an Eastern ontology encountering Western methodologies. Yeah. And in this talk, I was thinking about one I thought it is quite important questions when I'm doing some philosophy of science. Yeah, and some people always say that if you want to try to resolve the epistemological problems, then you shouldn't resorting by applying some ontological commitment. But I don't think that it'll be so, because from my learning and researching experiences, that I found a lot of cases that we need to define, or we need to spell out our ontological commitment before we can doing some epistemological problems. All right, so this is the main idea of this talk. All right, but I think before I'm going into my talk, I better to let the audience know who I am and where I'm from. Okay, my name is Sыdin Chжэнь. I'm now a faculty member of Institute of Philosophy at National Tsinghua University in Taiwan. Okay, my education background is like this. My first degree in Bachelor of Science is in Finance, and my second degree in Master's is in Economics. But I transferred to study philosophy in the PhD level because I found that some seemingly like economic questions, it is in fact philosophical questions. So that's why I transfer from business or management fields to the philosophy. Okay, so this is my education background, and now the current position is that I'm a professor of the Institute. I also co-appointed by one of our interdisciplinary programs at the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at the same universities, and also I'm currently director of our Institute of Philosophy, and also in 2015, I established a Center for Philosophy and Practice in response to a movement in philosophy of science called Philosophy of Science in Practice. So this center is if you would like, you may say that is the branch centers for this movement. And then I was newly elected this month as a chairman of Taiwan Philosophical Associations. Also, I was newly elected an executive committee member of the Research Institute of Humanities and Social Sciences of our Ministries of Science and Technology, Taiwan. Fields of my specification or specialization is causation and explanations, philosophical foundation of economic methodologies, philosophy of economics, philosophy of science, social science. And recently, starting from 2 years ago, also conduct some philosophical studies on issues of neuroscience, cognitive science, and artificial intelligence. Okay, this is my background. Okay, now we started to go into. I also want to introduce my university, National Tsinghua University. There's a counterpart of Tsinghua University in Beijing. Tsinghua is one of the two major universities in Beijing. Another one is Beijing University. Our university is reestablished in 1952 by our government. Our government retreated from mainland China in 1949 in concern of establishing or developing the nuclear science. So our government reestablished Tsinghua University in Taiwan for specializing in developing nuclear science. This university is located in Hsinchu cities. It is about 1 hour drive from Taipei cities. And it is very close to science-based industrial park. And this industrial park produced 21.8% of computer chips for the world. So it's quite science and technology cities. Our university used to be a science and technology-oriented university, especially strong in nuclear science, physics, material science, and electronic engineering. But nowadays, our university is an interdisciplinary university containing most of the fields, including science, engineering, life science, humanities, social sciences, business management, education, and arts. Okay, and this is the image of the rough image of our universities, and this is the map of Taiwan, and this is our capital, Taipei cities, and this is our international airport, and this is Hsinchu University. So we are just half our drive from the international airport, and another half drive to Taipei cities. Okay. Okay. Now I make a brief introduction of our institute. We have 10 faculty members, 4 from European continental traditions, another 4 from Anglo-American and analytic traditions. 1 faculty member specializes in ancient Greek philosophy. Another one is in Chinese philosophy. We currently have 35 MA degree program students, and we have 40 Bachelor of Arts degree program students. And each year we take about 8 new students to the master degree programs. We take about 10 undergraduate students for our undergraduate programs. Our institute is quite focusing on so-called cross-domain philosophical research and teachings. Cross-domain means, the first aspect of the cross-domain means interdisciplinaries. That means we conduct the philosophical studies on spatial sciences or philosophical studies on human sciences. Another one is intercultural. Because we have some faculty member focusing on Chinese philosophy, some faculty member specializing in continental tradition, also is an expert on the Kyoto School University, Japan's Kyoto School Universities. So there is some chance that they can conduct some comparative studies on East and West philosophy. So we're also focusing on intercultural comparative philosophical studies. The last one is cross-tradition. Cross-tradition means we have continental and we have analytical. So both sides have some discussion or research together. Another cross-tradition is that we have contemporary and we have ancient philosophy, so scholars. So we can have some cross-traditional philosophical research. Okay, so that's my brief introduction of myself and our university and our Institute of Philosophy. So now we go into our main topic today. So the basic question is that whether is it possible that we can resolve the epistemological problem by reshifting or readjusting our ontological commitment? The English classic empiricist David Hume say that no, it won't be possible. Okay, so now next I will present his argument. Okay, Hume's problem is there. Hume's famous problem is problem of inductions. So let's think about one scenario. In scenario one, we saw that the first aspirin tablet cures headache. And observation 2 is that the second aspirin tablet cures headache. And observation in case 3, we saw that the third aspirin tablet cures headache. Then probably we will infer that a conclusion say that all aspirin tablets cure headaches. So, but the question is, what gives us the inference ticket to infer from our observation to conclusions? The answer is that we probably need one more premises to put into our original premises to let our inferences have been valid. And this additional premise is called the principle of uniformity of natures. And the content of the principle is called that the nature will be like the past. So if we add in the principle of uniformity of nature in the premises, the whole argument will like this. We still have observation, the statement of observation 1, statement of observation 2, and statement of observation 3, and then blah, blah, blah. And then we put PUN, principle of uniformity of nature, as an additional premises. Then we can infer that all aspirin tablets cure headaches. Okay, but this is what Hume observed, that we would do that to validate our inductive inferences. But Hume asked a further question that it seems that principle of uniformity of natures is still a hypothesis. So since it is hypothesis, so where does our confidence come from when we accept principle of uniformity of nature is a key premise of our inductive inferences? Well, the answer is that we have our confidence only when there is a further PUN to guarantee that our current PUN is acceptable. So there comes this. If we want this ontological hypothesis to be valid, we need another argument for accepting this ontological hypothesis. So there comes another inductive inferences. So for example, this one is a first case. So we have the second case, probably observation 4, observation 5, or observation 6 constitute the case 2. So we have case 1 shows that in the first case, the first principle of uniformity of nature works. And in case 2, the second PUN works. And in third case, the third PUN works. So, but those three premises need another further PUN to guarantee that we can infer from all these premises to these conclusions. But this further PUN itself needs an even further PUN to guarantee that it is acceptable. And so this even further PUN needs another further PUN to do the same thing. So there comes an infinite regress to search for the ultimate PUNs. So Hume say that so it is impossible that we can use the ontological premises to resolve our epistemological problems. In our case, this epistemological problem is problem of inductions. So here comes Hume's solution is that he say that instead of looking for the ultimate PUN, he proposed that we conduct inductive inferences on the basis of customs, tendencies, or habit of our mind after we have been observing a class of similar cases. So with respect to Hume's suggestions, then our argument will look like this. The three observations are the same, but we need to add in the new premises, custom, tendency, or habits of our mind as additional premises, and then we can infer that on the basis of these customs, tendency, or habits of our minds, we can infer that all aspirin tablets cure headache. Okay, so this is Hume's solution to the problems. But one modern philosopher called Yuan Jing, he is not quite happy with Hume's solution. He say that, he make a comment on Hume's solution. He said that if anything characterizes Hume's philosophy, it is that he emphasizes theories while at the same time not considering his philosophy to be rational. So when Hume encounters difficult problems, rather than returning to assumptions as a way of solving problems, he introduces habits that lack any theoretical basis. This is, he mentioned in his 1928 papers. So in response to this question, Jing proposes ontological idea to resolve Hume's problems. And he proposed this principle. He said that regularity is certain, but the situation and process has no necessary point of arrival. So according to this principle, our argument will be rewrite like this. The first three premises are the same, and the additional premise will be like this: the arrival of the situations. Because according to Jing's principle, regularity is certain, but the situation in process is no necessary point of arrival. But once these situation and process arrived, then there's a principle. There's a regularity principle. This regularity will guarantee that our universal claim will be true. So in addition to these three original premises, we add in these new premises, the arrival of this situation and process, and then we can infer that all aspirin tablets cures headache because of we can, based on our regularities, to conduct such an inferences. But criticism on Jing's solution is that he misapplying ontological concept to resolve the epistemological problems. But my question is that, is this criticism sustainable or not? Well, before we assess Professor Jing's solutions to Hume's problems, probably we can take a relative problem to see if Jing's solutions to problem of induction is valid or not. And this another topic is so-called what is the scientific explanations. Let's think about toy examples. Say, probably in a usual day, we observe that John took tablet of aspirin, and we found that John's headache is effectively treated after John took the tablet of aspirin. So in this case, what needs to be explained is this phenomenon called John's headache is effectively treated. So also based on our knowledge based on the knowledge from our experience, we know that aspirin relieves headache. So we have the following three components. The first component is that we have initial condition. John took a tablet of aspirin, and the second component is the phenomenon law called, based on our knowledge of experiences, aspirin relieves headache. And the third item is a phenomenon to be explained. John's headache is effectively treated. But the question is, how do we make our explanation of this phenomenon John's headache is effectively treated. And according to the mainstream explanative model called covering law models or explanations, it looks like this. If we want to establish a scientific explanation of the phenomenon E, we need to have at least one premises of the statement about initial conditions. And the second is that we need to have at least one statement of general laws. So from these two premises, we can derive the phenomenon to be explained. So if we apply these models to this case, then we can write it down as this. Say, our covering law is aspirin relieves headache, and the initial condition is that John took a tablet of aspirin. So based on these two premises, then we can have the conclusion that John's headache is effectively treated. So on the basis of these explanations, this phenomenon has been explained. So this is the format of covering law explanation for the aspirin case. But according to this covering law framework, it indicates that if things to be explained, called explanatum, if things to be explained cannot be derived from the explanations or cannot be derived from the premises of the initial condition and the covering law, then the covering law should be rejected and new covering law should take its place. Okay? But the question is, we think, how do we normally react with regard to the simply refuted covering law? For example, how will we react when we find out that John's headache is not alleviated even after he took a tablet of aspirin? What we normally do is that instead of refuting the covering law that aspirin relieves headache, we normally try our very best to find out some plausible reasons to explain away this anomalous or these abnormal situations. So for example, we may conduct some further observations and find out that John, for most of the cases, took aspirin with coffee. And we also know that the caffeine would prevent aspirin from acting as effective medicines for curing the headache. So we can then come up with the following causal graphs. For our first laws of regularities, we know that aspirin relieve headaches. If we use X1 to represent the aspirin takings and Y represents the headache relievings, then X have influence on Y, and it has the effect of alpha, and alpha is a positive values. But in our abnormal case, we found out that John took aspirin with caffeine and with coffee, and we know that caffeine has a negative effect on aspirin effectiveness. So we have this one. This X2 represents the caffeine, and then this is headache relievings, and caffeine has a negative effect on headache relieving. The beta is less than zeros. So we patch up these two graphs, this first one and the second one, and we have the combined causal structures. So this is represent that X1 represents aspirin taking, X2 is coffee consuming. So on this causal path, we have positive inferences on headache relievings. On this causal path, we have negative effect on headache relievings. So we know alpha greater than 0, beta less than 0, but the absolute value of alpha is less than beta. So the result is that John's headache won't be relieved after taking the aspirin because he used coffee to take the aspirin rather than the waters. So according to this case, so instead of upholding the so-called covering law model explanations, this one, the covering law model explanations, it seems that we better to commit to the so-called causal structures model explanations. The whole model is like this. With respect to our models, or with respect to our case, when we find out that John took aspirins and his headache relieved, so we are conducting some inferences on a great number of assumptions. I'll say probably John took aspirins and this is headache relieving, but we conduct such a causal inference on the assumption of that John took aspirin without taking or without consuming coffee, or John took the aspirin without any other health problem, and so on and so on. Conduct such explanations on the assumptions. But when we find out that one phenomenon which is not complied with C1 influence on E, on the effect, then we start to try to find out some reasons to saying that why John took aspirin, but his headache does not relieve. Then we find out that, probably John took aspirin with coffee. So the second assumption's been relaxed. So a new additional factors been fed into the original simple models. So in these models, causal models, we have more complicated causal structure like this. But in the first models, we only have this simple graph. But in the second models, we have these complicated models. So the same thing applies, or the same procedure applies whenever we find out that there is some phenomenon does not fit with our old principles of regularities. So if we apply these causal structuralist models or explanations to our cases, then we can explain away why we, even when we face some anomalous phenomenon, we still won't given up our old hypothesis. Okay, so this is Nancy Cartwright. Since we say that this model is called a causal structuralist model of explanation, so probably you need to have some explanation on what a causal structure is. Nancy Cartwright say that causal structure is like this. A causal structure is a fixed enough arrangement of components with stable enough capacities that can give rise to the kind of regular associations or regularities that we describe in our scientific laws. So by following the idea of a component's capacity and the causal structure, then we may come up with the following inference for our case of John takes aspirin to relieve his headache. So we still have the same three same premises, but the additional premises like this, the arrival of a stable causal structure. So from these four premises, we can infer that all aspirin tablet cures John's headache. So according to Cartwright, it may seem that token relations is not governed or is not derived from the corresponding type relations. On the contrary, a type relation is possible to be brought up only when a relevant token relation is repetitively reproducible from a causal structure. So within this causal structure, the relevant causal factors, and this relevant causal factor possess stable causal power and capacities. These causal factors are deployed in a way that is reliable enough to able to repeatedly generate the token relations. So looking from this perspective, say, when there is a conflict between type relation and the observed token phenomenon, instead of blaming the inaccuracy of the type relations, what we should do is to investigate what difference exists between the causal structure which brings about the type relation and the structures which generates the anomalous new token relations. So once we can discover the differences between these two structures, the difference between the structures brought up the type relation and the structure brought up the anomalous token relations, then we can use knowledge of the difference to patch up a new causal structure so that the anomalous tokens relations can be accommodated into a causal structures in a way that is congruent with the original incompatible type relations. So following from what we have presented, we may find that Cartwright's ideas is congenius with Jin Yueling's ontological ideas. Okay, so let's examine how Chinese philosophers, including Yueling Jin, think about the causations. So we can answer this question by first examining what does Chinese mean by the word "she." Okay, so this is Francois Julien's, and he did a great number of studies on the idea of "she." He pointed out that the concept embedded in the word "she" is double-sided. He said that on the one hand, "she" or process or situation in process means the disposition of things. In other words, it refers to the condition, refers to the position, refers to the circumstances, configuration, arrangement, or structure of things. But on the other hand, it also meant force, power, potential, and the movement of things. In other words, the word "she" or situation in process carries both static and dynamic connotations. The metaphysics underlying the term "she" is to perceive reality as a process of ongoing transformations. So this kind of metaphysics aims to urge the kind of potential that originates not in human initiative, but instead results from the very disposition of things. So from this metaphysical perspective, it may seem that reality can be perceived as a particular deployment or arrangement of things to be relied on and to work to one's advantages. So in consequences, all the achievements of human beings, including the wonder of art, the acquisition of wisdoms, victory in war, or the beauty of peace of calligrapher, lies in the strategically exploiting the propensity emanating from the particular configuration of realities to the maximum effect possible. So the consequence is the notions of efficacies. So as mentioned earlier, she expresses the state that falls between the static and dynamic. So in a similar vein, the intuition of efficacy also includes two ideas. The first one is the deployment of setup of things. The second one is the propensity or the tendency of things. So following this double-sided idea of efficacies, we can then say that things can be arranged in a specific way so as to be disposed to be effective. So in other words, every arrangement or every structure, every configuration of environment possesses an inherent potential or inherent propensities that is fulfilled by the efficacy of disposition. So it is based on this idea that reality is conceived as an ongoing process of transformations. So according to Julien's observations, there comes two concepts of opportunities. So for Westerners, opportunity means that a fleeting chance resulting from a favorable conjunction of circumstances that prompts actions and favors stress. But for Chinese, it regarded as a most suitable moment to intervene in the course of a process that has already begun. So the moment that seemed the combinations of all the potentiality gradually acquired, and that makes the combinations possible to derive the greatest efficacy from it. So as is manifested in our two examples, Hulin's examples and Nancy Cartwright's, it may seem that epistemological issues cannot be adequately dealt with without considering the ontological constraints prescribed by the scientists. So for those regularity law-based approaches, it seems that proponents of this approach would like to support an image of science which maintains that the world is governed by a fixed pyramidal structures with the hierarchical universal laws of nature. The picture is just like this. This figure is taken from Nancy Cartwright's 1999 book called The Double World. But for those capacity-based methodologies, supporters of this approach would prefer an image of science. And this image of science would uphold the view that the world is a double world, which is constituted by the variety of patches of local laws. And these local laws are generated by a number of different stable causal structures. This is the image of the double world. The world has been patched up by the small patches of these regularities being produced by a varieties of, or a great number of different causal structures. So looking from this perspective, it seems that we may then argue that there is indeed a congenial relation between genes ontology. If we say that genes ontology can represent one of the Eastern ontology of regularity and situation process on the one hand, and the capacity-based approach of the contemporary Western philosophy of science can represent the Western methodology on the other hand, then we can say that there's indeed the congenial relations between Eastern ontology and Western methodologies. And based on this, I would like to claim that then we can resolve the epistemological problems on the basis of our readjustment or our reshifting of our ontological commitment. All right, thanks for your listening.
Коллеги, вопросы, пожалуйста, или какие-то комментарии? Так, если нужен перевод, то я переведу, если самостоятельно справитесь, то...
Thank you very much for your interesting presentation. Well, I should say that the idea that the West, some ideas of the Eastern philosophy can provide some very useful insights for the modern Western or Russian philosophy is very popular in the Institute of Philosophy of Russian Academy of Science for the last months. But in this very case, I would ask the following question. You pick on the specific example of pills, aspirin pills curing headaches, some dynamic relation between things. And so the gene's ontology, the ontology of a particular dynamic situation suits very well to this particular example. But if we take another classical human example of white swans, when we infer from seeing the first swan as white, the second swan as white, the third swan as white, the 100th swan as white, to the inference, to the conclusion that all the swans are white, then how can this gene's ontology help us in this case? Because we have no dynamic relation. We have just relation of attribution of some whiteness to a particular animal, and that's all. There is no dynamic process.
There's no situation and process involved in.
Yes. How can we deal with this example?
Okay. With respect to your questions, that probably genes, ontological ideas can be applied to your case, because in your case, if I remember that we have the black swan in New Zealand, right? But we have we don't have we don't have the black swan in other places in the world. So within the domains, except the New Zealand, the situation in process is quite reliable in these areas, except New Zealand. So once the domain of the world to include New Zealand, then Jing will say that probably this is because the limit of our knowledge, but the world is indeed, there are two kinds of swans. So we can still use Jing's ideas, or the so-called causal structures ideas, to patch up revised explanations to say that, oh no, all swans are white is not right, because in some specific domain in the world, there is some black swans over there. Yeah.
But sorry, how can the category of she help in this very case?
She, in this case, it's just like black and white case. But in aspirin cases, there's a continuum between black and white. There's a continuum between black and white. So she, it seems that she will better fit with the black and white with continuum. But it seems not that right for the case that have some absolute black and white cases. But if we, or can I say this is an extreme case for the she. This is the extreme case for she. So she still can be used to these extreme cases, I think. Sorry about that.
Ну, ответ вкратце заключался в том, что, соответственно, здесь мы замыкаем эту ситуацию только на ситуации нашего знания на тот момент, в котором нету знания о других лебедях, и, соответственно, таким образом тоже можем обратиться к этой ситуации. Ну и уточняющий вопрос, соответственно, относительно того, как все-таки эта категория помогла бы нам решить эту проблему юмовской индукции, вот в данном конкретном примере. Ну, здесь был ответ, что это некий такой предельный вариант применимости этой категории, но, соответственно, как именно его применить, тут однозначного ответа даже нет. Еще вопрос? Да, пожалуйста.
Thank you for your report. As I understand you, say, if I use Eastern approach, can I say that dynamics and statics is the special cases of each other? There is no differences. In some cases, no differences between dynamic state and static state. It doesn't mean. It's just the form of something else. Can I say it, or it mean nothing?
Can you?
As I understood the question, so when we speak about Eastern ontology, is statical position and dynamical process, can it be
some special cases
Different
of each other.
states.
Yeah.
So, dynamical and static positions.
Static position, static status means the position or the power or the capacity. But things could have this power or capacity, but it won't be.
Can you switch on the microphone?
But it won't be effective.
Switch on, please. Oh, okay.
Okay. So yeah, things can have two status. One is static status. Something has some capacities, but it won't be effective or it won't be affected unless some other components or some other factors in the world to join with it. Then they jointly can trigger these factors, capacities, to reach a certain degree of efficacy. Yeah. So you say probably there is one thing of two sides. I didn't get that because this is two states, right? One is state.
So do statics and dynamics oppose each other? Or are they intertwined, like yin and yang?
Before they interact, before all of those factors involved interact with each other, they are two statuses. But once they are interact together, then we can say now it's get into the status of transformations, like something like that. Yeah.
So they're different actually.
Yeah.
Ну, собственно, вопрос заключался в том, насколько вот в рамках восточной онтологии мы противопоставляем статические и динамические состояния, или они являются частью единого целого. Ну и, собственно, ответ заключался в том, что, собственно, статические состояния, что эти процессы, соответственно, различны, да, и что есть вещи, которые находятся в статическом состоянии, и, соответственно, когда они начинают взаимодействовать, то возникает некое принципиально новое динамическое состояние. И тогда вот возникает то, что мы называем процессом, собственно, ситуация в процессе. Ну, как-то так. Еще вопросы? So I have one more question, just very small one. Do you somehow treat this idea of the situation, compare or something like this, the idea of situation and process with the classical dialectics, like Hegel's dialectics? Hegel, yeah.
No,
you don't take this.
No,
yeah,
I don't
okay.
take this.
Yeah, just a question.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much once again. Thank you. И я приглашаю следующего докладчика, профессор Кайюань Чэн, доктор философии, защитивший диссертацию по философии в городском университете Нью-Йорка, диссертацию по Крипке и Вингенштейну, профессор Института философии сознания и познания Национального университета Ян-Мин в Тайване. Это медицинский университет, поэтому философский факультет, присутствующий там, или кафедра, он ориентирован именно на проблемы сознания, познания, нейрофилософии и так далее. И область научных интересов профессора Чэна – это философия языка, философия сознания, собственно, Wittgenstein, китайская философия, прежде всего фигура Цзуаньцзы, метафизика и проблемы когнитивных наук и нейрофилософии. Тема доклада «Две модели личностной идентичности в китайской философии». So, please.
Okay, so it's really a pleasure to be here. Before we come here, we were in Tomsk. And it was a very good strategy because we feel very warm here in Moscow. So today I'll talk about actually two Chinese models of personal identity, and I will explain why I talk about the Chinese model, because the issue of personal identity is widely known in the Western tradition. It's a very fundamental issue, and I will try to convince you that it's important to approach this issue from a different tradition. That's what I will try to do. So before I start, I would like to introduce to you where I come from. So Yamin University is located in Taipei, and the name of the university is actually named after a Chinese philosopher and a general. And as far as I know, this is probably, Yamin University is the only one university in the Chinese-speaking world that is named after a philosopher. So that I'm very proud. And our university is located on a hill. It's quite steep. And my School of Humanities is located on the top. You know, these universities, they like to locate the School of Humanities to a very remote area. But we have a better view. And so we are very physically fit because every day we have to climb up the hill and down and up and down. Right? Very good exercise. And this is in our neighborhood. We have hot springs. It's world class. You are all welcome to drop by. It's like our natural banya. You can really, from my office, in 10 minutes, after I leave my office, I'm in the hot spring. So that's my secret weapon to do my academic work. So Yamin University is located in the capital, in Taipei. And Tainan in the south is a historical city where the Dutch in the 16th century used to occupy. And Kaohsiung is a harbor city further south. Kaohsiung, that's my hometown. Okay. And my university is a relatively young university. It was established in 1975. And it's a medicine-based university. It started as a medical school to take care of the soldiers who came from mainland China after 1949. And since it's a medical school, so it's relatively small, but it's one of the top medical university in Taiwan. So we have only 400 faculty and 4,000 students. Half of the students are undergraduate and another half are postgraduate. And so most of the schools are in the broadly medical area. So you have nursing school, medical school, biological science, etc. And our School of Humanities and Social Science was established only 12 years ago. So something about myself. I started as a civil engineer. That was my background from Jiao Tong University. So we also have 4 other Jiao Tong universities in mainland China. But the government established the Jiao Tong University after 1949 in Taiwan. It's also located in the Science Park of Hsinchu, next door to Tsinghua University. So it's very good in engineering. And then after my 2 years military, I went on to study philosophy in New York. And then I got my tenure position from the National Zhongzheng University in the south of Taiwan. And then I moved to Taipei to become the vice dean of the School of Humanities and Social Science for 3 years, and then became dean for 2 years. And then the University of the Medicine, I think they find philosophers useful. So I was hired as a vice president. And then this year, I became the dean of the Office of Student Affairs to take care of the students of the medical sciences. So that's the background. So the main purpose of today is to examine the issue of personal identity in the Western tradition by exposing some of its fundamental presuppositions. And these fundamental presuppositions, I think they are rarely kind of pointed out. So that's why I think we need some kind of different tradition in order to expose that. And to expose those fundamental presuppositions, I think is very important because it will help us to see alternative way of thinking about the same issue. Okay. Then, of course, I will examine the different approach from the Chinese tradition, which I inherit from my culture. So in the significance, I hope to convince you that is that we will be in a better position to understand and assess some of the revisionary accounts in the contemporary Western philosophy, especially the Anglo-American analytic philosophy, where I was trained, and to develop new ways of thinking about the issue that can reshape how we act in the world as persons. So that's the outline of today's talk. So first, I will introduce a little bit of the idea of personal identity. It's basically a forensic idea. It has something to do with responsibility attribution. And as we will talk about later, John Locke, who started this topic, discussed it in a religious context about the final judgment, the last judgment, the final day. And then since it's rooted in this religious context, actually it has a presupposition, which is God's perspective. And that is crucial. That's crucial. So I'll point out that this God's perspective will create some of the very difficult challenge to almost all the theories that try to answer to this question of personal identity. So that's why I move on to third part to talk about in the contemporary context, philosophers like Parfit or Olson who take up the psychological or the physical approach, even though they do away with God, but they do not do away with the kind of the influence of God's perspective. And that's the most crucial assumptions in the whole Western tradition I want to examine. And then I move on to the last part, trying to say that the Chinese tradition does not have the God's perspective at all. It's a really nature-based perspective, and that will fundamentally change the way this issue is approached in a very different way from the Western. Okay, that's the basic outline. And as you can see in the last part, I will examine Johnston and Schechtman's view. Their views are quite revisionary in the Western tradition. Very different from the Lockean, that kind of approach. So I will use my Chinese models, the Confucian and the Taoist model, the two models, to look at their positions, and then saying that they will fall under the Confucian model. Right? And then I would develop a model that has not yet been developed as far as I can see, based on Georg Nothoff. He is a leading neuroscientist and neurophilosopher. Even though he himself does not directly talk about the issue of personal identity, but I would devise his work to provide a Taoist model. Right. So I would, it's a little bit wild, but I will try to say what I'm doing to you. Okay, so first we can distinguish the difference between self and personal identity. The two concepts are quite closely connected. And many people, even including John Locke, might sometimes use these two notions interchangeably. But I think we can say that they are somewhat different. when we talk about self, it seems to be something more subjective, like, it refers to your first-person experience. Right? I myself, something subjective. And it's something synchronic. It's something right here, right now. I feel I'm myself. Right? Like a movie, Born Identity. He lost his long-term memory. But right here, right now, he has a sense of himself. It's just that he does not know who he is as a person. Right. So in contrast, the notion of person is more diachronic, right, and more public in terms of it has a responsibility, right, for his action. And the notion of action involves the temporal dimension. Right? You have to be responsible for what you did earlier, etc. So it has a diachronic and public that kind of features in the notion of persons. Okay, so personal identity thus is a notion of like a forensic notion. Okay, and as I said, it has the legal aspect and also the religious aspect. That's the background. And when John Locke talked about this issue, he started as three important categories. He started with mass of matter. And then he said that when you want to discuss the identity of mass of matter, you have to apply the numerical identity, which involve very strict notion of identity. Right? As far as one tiny particle is taken away from an object, that object will cease to be the same object. That's the idea, very strict. And this numerical identity will not be applied to a living body in Locke's view. Right? A living body, even though the particles might depart from the object, it can remain the same object as far as the object has shared a common life, biological life, across time. And when it comes to a person, the kind of common life, that kind of criteria, John Locke thinks that will cease to be applied to a person. Right? Because a person has a very essential feature, which is a rational conscious thinking being. Right? So in that case, we need to apply different criteria. Right? So I think you all know that he applied the kind of idea of consciousness and memory to offer such a criteria. So the very basic idea is that as far as I remember what I did in the past, I would be the same person as that person, something like that. And it's very natural. So he asks us to imagine that if you have a bird or something, if the bird or a parrot can talk and tell a story of everything that he did. I used to talk to young people about how to think on the street, and then the government did not like what I did and asked me to drink poison and put me to death, etc., etc. Then you realize that, oh, you are Socrates, right? Because the bird has the same memory as Socrates, etc. So that's the memory criteria or conscious criteria for personal identity. And this view is a so-called non-substance kind of view, right? Because the kind of memory or consciousness is not a substance, right? That's the kind of innovation of John Locke's view. So as far as any material, physical or spiritual material that can realize the same memory, that material will be the same person, right? So that's very creative, very advanced, right? So when John Locke talk about this kind of memory-based non-substance view of personal identity, he is talking about the issue within a substance mode metaphysics. That is popular in his time. Okay, so his innovation is to adopt a non-substance view of personal identity. And I will try to say, and you probably all know that that will create a problem. I mean, exactly the creative part of his work will make him into trouble. Okay, so historically, Wright and Butler has raised some issue with his criteria. Right? One is the so-called transitivity. Right? So the idea is actually quite simple. I might remember 5 years ago what I did. So I'm the same person with me, with that person 5 years ago. Right? And 5 years ago, I might remember what I did 10 years ago. So the person 5 years ago is identical with the person 10 years ago. Okay. So by transitivity, me now should be the same person as that person 10 years ago. But now I don't remember what I did 10 years ago. So by his criteria, I am not a person as that person 10 years ago. So now we have a contradiction. I am not the same person, but I'm not the same person and I am the same person. So that's a contradiction. And Butler has another objection, like circularity. Like when I remember who I am 5 years ago, you are already supposing that that person is the same person as me, etc. It seems that in the criteria of memory, you are already presuppose that you are the same person in your memory, something like that. Okay, so these are very popular historical objections to John Locke's view, which makes sense. So the subsequent contemporary philosophers, they try to overcome that. But the overall theoretical approach, such as Parfit, remain the same. They try to make improvements on John Locke. So that's the basic idea. I will skip this kind of details and get to the more interesting part of what I try to say. But one interesting objection by Leibniz is that he agrees that consciousness and memory is necessary for a criteria of personal identity, but insufficient to ground personal identity. He thinks that the memory and consciousness is too vulnerable, too weak, right, to ground personal identity. Personal identity has to be more solid, more objective. Right? So he thinks that substantial real identity is still needed. Right? So you can see that Leibniz, together with the other two historical objections, they are all based on the kind of demand for objectivity, for the kind of criteria of personal identity, right, which John Locke's psychological features cannot meet. Right. So I call this incongruence problem for John Locke. Right. The incongruity problem is that the metaphysical requirements, which involve high demand of objectivity, cannot be reconciled with the psychological non-substance candidates. Okay. So, and I think the problem arises from John Locke's taking up God's perspective, because he is standing on the position of God to offer objective criteria. Right? Because it would be the God's job in the last day to call upon the same person for reward and punishment of what that person did in his lifetime. So the criteria has to be strictly objective. And John Locke is taking up the job of God to do that. Right. I think that's what he's doing. So the criteria have to be strictly objective. Right. But John Locke at the same time proposed a very innovative idea, the kind of psychological properties. That makes it too weak. Okay. So if you look at the kind of contemporary study of John Locke, they are struggling. The contemporary John Locke scholars, they are trying to find a way out for John Locke. Okay, but we skip the details. My focus is that John Locke has a long-standing influence on subsequent discussion, which is to adopt a strictly objective standard for personal identity. All right. So these are the three assumptions I think that are kind of taken in John Locke's discussion. One is to take up God's perspective, which requires an absolute objective criteria. And second is to adopt a substance mode metaphysics or substance property metaphysics. And three is to classify things into matters, living body, persons, etc., to apply very clear-cut concepts when he discusses about this matter. So these are the three assumptions. Very natural. And I think most of the Western philosophers will feel naturally fine. Right? So they tend to be missed. And I think these are the assumptions that are not shared by Chinese philosophers, like Zhuangzi and many others. Right? I mentioned Zhuangzi because he's my hero. And also because I'm not a real expert of Chinese philosophy. I have to make a confession. So I studied engineering and analytic philosophy. And I got really enlightened 10 years ago by Zhuangzi, by the dream of butterfly. That's how I got into this area. Right? So I focus more on Zhuangzi. So Zhuangzi would have the three assumptions that are different from John Locke. One is a godless worldview. And second is a kind of qi or process-based, that kind of transformation ontology. And third is that he will adopt concepts, but concepts to him are not clear-cut, like that fit logical standard. Right? Concepts are really more loose. And in a way, his epistemology is really like epistemic, that kind of ignorance. Right? There are a lot of discussions about knowledge. Right? Zhuangzi will say something like, do I know that I really don't know, or do I really, like, if I claim something I know, do I really know what I know is true, etc.? Or when I say I don't know something, how do I know that I really know, etc.? So he's very sensitive to our knowledge and to our concepts. Right. So he would be opposed to a very clear-cut, that kind of concept. So that's Zhuangzi. He was like a figure 400 years ago. Okay, so Parfit is probably the most important contemporary philosopher on this issue. And he is, I think, a Lockean. And he tried to improve upon John Locke. So he would say that personal identity consists in the holding of a psychological relation R, right? And the psychological relation R is overlapping the kind of memory, personality, etc. Right. So again, I will skip a lot of details, but this psychological theory is aimed at resolving the kind of objections that are raised by Wright and Butler, etc. Okay. And he will even say that identity is not what matters in survival. Relation R is what matters. I hope people here are familiar with the topic. Right. And that idea, psychological relation R, is really faithful to John Locke's idea. When I survive, what matters in my survival? The most important is that my memory continues. Right? whether I have the same physical body, whether somewhat different material like computer chips realize my memory, that's relatively fine. But in that case, I don't know how to enjoy drinking a cup of wine if I don't have a physical body. But for profit, that's probably not so important. The most important is that I have this continuity of memory and psychology. Okay. And Zhuangzi would make his diagnosis of these philosophers. Right. First, based on his different assumptions, he would say that the act of essentializing the person in terms of psychological relation R is questionable. Right? Persons cannot be simply reduced to something psychological. The psychological features is one among many factors that are more or less important. Some are more important, some are less important, but they are all relevant in constituting what a person is. Right? But you see the strategy of the contemporary philosophers in the Western tradition. They tend to theorize, and in that sense, they tend to essentialize a person in certain ways. And that's the move that Zhuangzi would be very careful not to make that kind of move. And second is that psychological relation R is a formal relation, right? Because it's something objective, right? Even though it's psychological properties, right? But he emphasized on the formal relation of those psychological states, right? So you see the traits of John Locke, right? His criteria requires something strictly objective. And Parfit is faithful to that kind of criteria. Right? So he's the descendant of the same tradition, that is clear. Right? And that has its root, from what I can see, in the God-based tradition. Okay. So even though Parfit, I don't know if he's a Christian or he shares that kind of religion, but he inherits that framework. And third is that identity, in a strictly logical sense, breaks down in Parfit's theory, as he acknowledged. Right? But this is not a surprise to Zhuangzi, right? Because it will break anyway in the real life. Right? So it's not a big deal to begin with. Okay. And Zhuangzi's own thinking about identity, he is very intriguing. When I read him, some of the passages reminds me of like Quine. Quine in the analytic tradition will propose something like an indeterminacy of meaning. Right? Words do not have a fixed content, that kind of considerations. And Zhuangzi will say something like do words have a determinate reference or content. Right? And content seems to be perspective dependent and context dependent. He talked about the use of the words like indexical, this and that. Right? When we say this is rectangular, right? So you are saying that requires you are taking a certain perspective. If you are taking a perspective of another angle or from another species, the answer might be very different. Right? Or when you say this is something, it already makes reference to another perspective. Right? It's only on the basis of the existence of another perspective you can make the claim that there is this perspective. So Zhuangzi is a very complicated person. He is very sensitive to our saying when we assert something. There is already necessarily another something serving as a background, which is not what you are asserting. So he always sees the complementary part of what you are asserting. So when you are affirming the content of P, it already requires making reference to the background condition of not P. So it's very delicate philosophical thinking. So personal identity, whatever it may be to Zhuangzi, has to make reference to the vast background conditions that made a highlighting of the psychological possible. Right? So when Parfit or John Locke pay attention to some salient feature of a person, like memory, which is fine. Zhuangzi will remind Parfit or John Locke, you have to look at all the background conditions, all the things that are not psychological, that are relevant to the constitution of the individual person. Right? Don't ignore that. They are equally important. That's his point. Okay, so in this perspective, people like Olson propose something very different from Parfit or John Locke. He said personal identity consists in the continuity of a human animal. So it's more like a biological organism. Right? This looks very different from the psychological approach, but from Zhuangzi's perspective, they are the same because they are aiming at giving objective criteria. Right? Okay. And so Zhuangzi criticized theorizing. He will not oppose to our theorizing about things. That is useful. That is even necessary for our living in a society, in our physical environment. But he would remind us that we should not be limited to taking up a certain perspective or taking up a certain kind of theoretical point of view. We should not be bound by that. We can use that, but realize that we use that only in a certain context. We should be free from its limitation. And we can theorize in many other different contexts. And those theorizing would be valid only relative to a certain context. So that's, if you can read Chinese, he has a saying that is one of my favorites, 得其环中以应无穷. Yeah, I mean, we can freely adopt all the perspective in coping with various given circumstances. We can theorize, no problem, but we have to bear in mind the limitation of each perspective. Okay, so that's my relying on Zhuangzi to expose John Locke and his subsequent philosophers who implicitly adopt a God-based perspective that requires objective standards. Right. And Chinese way of thinking, Zhuangzi belongs to the Taoist tradition, and Confucian thinks quite differently from Taoist. I will talk about it very shortly. But both positions, Confucian and Taoist, their way of thinking are very different from the Western. So they don't have that kind of strict logical standard, that kind of absolute objective criteria. So when they also talk about identity, right? Because this is such a basic concept in daily life, we have to try to identify something across time, right? All the people needs to have some concept of identity. But for the Chinese, it's not this strict logical concept, right? So, so for the Chinese, it's more like the loose way of saying that the identity of something is relation to other things. So take, for example, the glass of a cup of water here. So we try to say what's the identity of the cup. Right? The Western tradition, I think, will just look at the object itself and try to find out the essential property of the cup and trying to define its identity by selecting a certain important properties of the cup. But for the Chinese, when they look at the cup, they will say, oh, the cup can be placed on a table, and the cup can be picked up by my hand, and then I can drink water that is contained in the cup to quench my thirst. So to say the identity of a cup, you have to make reference to its relational pattern to different objects in the environment. So that's very different idea. And of course, this cup can have many, many different kinds of relations. Right? So for a Confucian scholar, a saint would be defined as someone who can privilege the ideal relational pattern and define the more respectful identity for the cup, for object. And so the kind of identity is more or less loose. It's not strictly logical criteria. That's the main difference. And Taoists will think along the line of Confucian, but only more complicated, more sophisticated. The Confucian will go for a positive way of finding out some relational pattern. But the Taoist will remind a Confucian scholar, right, when you privilege a certain relation, pay attention to all the surrounding properties or relations that are left out. Right. Those left out relations, they are equally important for the identity of the object you try to identify. Right. So that is a Taoist. Very sophisticated. Okay, so that's the basic idea. So with that in mind, we can now come back to look at some of the contemporary philosophers in the analytic philosophical tradition. They propose views of personal identity that look very different from the mainstream. So one is Mark Johnston. I visited Princeton 10 years ago. He was the one who inspired me to suddenly understand the dream of the butterfly in the Zhuangzi. Right? And he proposed a very different view. Actually, when he was a child, he was brought up in the Jesuit tradition. And I tried to look at the material, the literature. His view is rarely picked up by other philosophers. I think his view, because his view is very revisionary in the tradition. So people tend to just ignore him, despite the fact that he is at Princeton. That's my personal assessment. So he provides a judgment-dependent account of personal identity. So I would be the same person as the other one, as long as, okay, I'll be the same person as the person in the future if I make the judgment that I would be that same person. So whether I'm the same person or not depends on my own judgment. That's his view. So this idea sounds a little bit crazy, but it could be natural. For example, if I'm a dentist, so at least part of the identity of my dentist seems to rely on how I think I am. You know? My attitude toward my profession as a dentist kind of shape my identity of being a dentist, or my being a father. You know? My attitude of who I am, like who I am as a father, determine my identity as a father. Right. So that gives a very different nuance to the idea of identity. So in this way of looking at personal identity, it becomes very different. It's not something purely objective that you can look at who the person is, what the identity of is from a logical objective standard. No, it involves the person's own attitude toward him or herself. Very different. And Maria Schechtman, I think she is teaching in Chicago. he has similar view. He has a narrative view in 1996, and then she developed it into a more complicated view, but along the same line in 2014, the so-called person life account. So the basic idea is that my own narrative, the story I tell about myself, determine who I am. So that's a very similar idea. Or other people telling stories about me will partly determine who I am, etc. Right. So these two views, if we look at the perspective of the Confucian and Taoist view, I think they perfectly fall under the Chinese model. They no longer adopt the strictly logical objective standard. Okay, that's how I look at their view. Okay, so both are free of an objective criteria. Okay, so, and in Zhuangzi, my hero, he said something very strange. When he described in one passage a true man, or a saint, or enlightened person, and that person says something like, sometimes I think I'm a cow, sometimes I think I'm a horse. Right. So I think for someone who said that on the street, that person will be put in a psychiatric hospital. Right. So, and you find this kind of sayings in Zhuangzi or the Taoist text. So, but I think we can take this seriously. But the point is how to make sense of it. Okay, and so I think we can have two ways of making sense of it. One is to adopt Johnson and Schechtman. So Zhuangzi has an implicit judgment-dependent account view. Right? Who I am as a person in the future depends partly on how I think about myself. Right? So I think about myself as a cow, partly determined about my identity. Of course, normal person, I think for Western people like Johnston and Schechtman, they would say that I will identify my future self as a person. Okay, they would do it this way. But Zhuangzi is very different. He will identify his future person as a cow, as a horse, or as a nature. Okay, so that is this very different ontological view of Zhuangzi or the Taoist. Okay, but here I think this is one way of doing things. But now I try to suggest that there is another way of making sense of this sentence, which makes it more sophisticated. Right? And that's the reading I was inspired by Georg Northoff. We have collaboration for 10 years. He's German, but now working in Canada. He's now a research chair at the Royal Mental Health Research Center. He's a philosopher, a brain scientist, and a psychiatrist. So now Zhuangzi is also one of his favorites. So, so we are trying to develop an idea of personal identity based on his work of neuroscience. So, so his idea is that a spatial temporal transformation of world to brain relation. Okay, this would be very complicated, but let me start it here. As best background condition for categorizing what a person is and for the possibility of a distinction between person and non-person. Okay. I look at my time, how much time I have to know. It's 5:38. Let me have 5 more minutes. 5 more minutes. I will try to explain the story. Okay. This is the last part that we are currently working on it. It's very new. So, yeah, he has written several books. Unlocking the Brain was published by the Oxford University Press in 2014, I think. and the spontaneous brain in 2018. And we started collaborating when I sent him my paper on the dream of the butterfly. And then his view of the brain was inspired by Kant. So basically, that was 10 years ago. He published in Cell. Kant thinks that we have knowledge of the world because there are transcendental conditions about our 12 categories and intuition of space and time. And he adapts this idea, transcendental condition, to his research on the brain. Right? So he says that similarly, the brain has to have certain intrinsic conditions in order to produce, for the brain to produce self and consciousness. So he looked at the spontaneous activity of the brain when the brain is at a resting state. And by resting state, it means that when the brain does not reduce any stimuli from the environment. So even at that resting state, the brain is still spontaneously active and consuming at least 60% of our energy of the brain. Right? So that there must be something intrinsically important there as a condition for the possibility of self and consciousness. That is his idea. So, but that's 10 years ago. Okay. 2 years ago, he moved from the intrinsic condition of the brain to world-to-brain relation. So his idea is very different from the mainstream neuroscience. The mainstream neuroscience, just as I said, we look at the brain as the cup and look at all the chemical reactions going on here, look at all the electrical impulses going on here, and then say how they correlate with the production of self and consciousness. But Notov has this idea. I think that is in agreement with Heidegger and, of course, Zhuangzi, etc., saying that if you want to look at the nature of the brain, you have to look at its connection to the environment, to the world. So the brain or the cup has its own frequency and wave frequency, and the world has its wave frequency. And these two will have to connect intrinsically, necessarily, in order for the brain to produce self and consciousness. So he would look at the brain's identity as a world-to-brain relation. Right. So now he says that the brain functions in the Eastern mode, right, or the Asian, that kind of ontology. Right. So, and that was 2 years ago. But this year, he moved on from relation to transformation. That's the idea from Zhuangzi, the idea of 变化, the 化 is change and transformation. That is very basic to the Chinese philosophy, like I Ching, the Book of Change, as the foundation of this philosophical thinking. So in the basic ontology in the Chinese, change and transformation is the most fundamental. Identity of something is not denied, but the identity of anything is only relative, is only temporary, relative to the ongoing transformation. And the Western mainstream tradition, I think, is the opposite. The logical foundation has to be there in order to talk about identity. And change and transformation has to define based on that foundation. So it's different direction. So Notov adopt this transformation. He got this idea from reading Zhuangzi through my introduction. So there is a famous story of Zhuangzi's wife. When she died, Zhuangzi was very sorry. Was like, Zhuangzi was, this is a famous story in every child growing up in the Chinese tradition, or even in Korea, Japanese, they all know about the story. When Zhuangzi's wife died, he was found playing drums and singing. And And his good friend, logician Hui Si, went to him and very angry, saying that how can you be so happy? But then Zhuangzi said, no, I was very sad in the beginning. But then I look upon the passage of my wife's life and saying that the transition is like the transformation of 4 seasons, etc. So he was looking at his wife's existence from the perspective of nature. Right. Before she was born and after she died, the temporal scale is larger than the limited spatial temporal stage of the wife. But the kind of larger perspective is not God's perspective. It's still a perspective within nature. Right. So that's Zhuangzi's perspective. And then when you look at the identity of the person, it would be not just focus on the individual person, as we said earlier. He would focus on the vast background conditions of nature that nourish to the constitutive of a person. Right. So that's how he would look at this issue. So anyway, I should give me 2 more minutes. And I'll just say very quickly the kind of neurophilosophical work done by our collaborator, Georg Nothoff. He has a paper published last year in Physics of Life. And then also based on our co-written paper, we talk about time. As I said, time, there are 2 ideas of time. One is a Newtonian, absolute sense of space and time, like a container view. Right? Space and time are absolute, real, and then events happen within the space and time. But then there's another view held by Leibniz, saying that space and time are inherent in the changes of events. So in a way, the events, they can create their own time, in a way. Time are inherent in those events. Right. So, and Zhuangzi, so we have written a paper trying to say that Zhuangzi has a similar view here. And then we adopt this construction view of time to the brain science. So his basic idea is to try to find the common currency between neural activity and mental features. So this is very different from the mainstream neuroscience, which only try to look at the correlation between neural activity and mental features. You give them certain kind of cognitive stimuli and then look at how the brain functions. But he tried to look at the neural activity and actually trying to find the spatial temporal features of the neural activity, and then trying to find spatial temporal features of the mental activity, and then try to find their commonality. And if he can do that, he can show that the neural and the mental, they are ontologically continuous. They are not a Cartesian dualism. And he is doing this kind of work based on clinical and empirical and philosophical work. So I have to skip the details. He has a lot of empirical and theoretical details to show the common currency between neural and mental, which I have to skip. So the most important is that based on his detailed findings of the spatial temporal mechanisms that exist between the neural and the mental, he argues that what happens in the common currency is the neural-mental transformation. So the neural gone through transformational process to produce self and consciousness. So both are ontologically the same ground. Right. So this kind of view, I think, can give the theoretical kind of resources for us to think about personal identity based on the kind of a Taoist, that kind of sophisticated thinking. So a person, the identity of the person will depend on the kind of transformational process of nature that serves as a base background conditions in order for individual person to arise from that. Right? So that's the most sophisticated way of making sense of the important passage that I just quoted, that sometimes I think I'm a cow, sometimes I think I'm a horse. So by saying that the person is trying to say that I, as an individual person, I have the same ontological roots of cow and horse and nature things. Right? So by doing things this way, we don't focus on the human agency, the rational agency. That is really the Western highlight, which is a very fine tradition. But there are other ways of thinking it. The Taoist position trying to remind us that we are really more ontologically like relying upon and continuous with nature order. Right? So the whole picture will be rearranged. So that's the general direction. But as you say, as you can see, there are a lot of details to be filled in. So, and this is a project of a book that I'm trying to develop. So I can only sketch what is being attempted here. So just to conclude, there are some implications. In the Confucian model, such as the of Johnson and Chapman, the emphasis of the inquiry is on an individual person. In this regard, the model remains similar to the traditional mainstream framework of Locke, Parfit, and Orson. Okay. And the Taoist is really more radical that I adapt from Nordhoff. The emphasis is on the background conditions of the natural order of transformation for the possibility of an individual person. So thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Коллеги, вопросы? Так, я сразу смотрю в правильном направлении.
Thank you very much for your perfect presentation. But in fact, I have 3 questions, if I'm allowed to ask them. My first question concerns your glass of water example, because as far as I understand, you oppose the Western, let us say, essentialist approach to the identity, to the Eastern, well, contextual approach to the identity. So for Western mind, a glass of water is a glass filled with H2O, yes? And a glass of whiskey is a glass filled with CH5OH. But for the contextualist mind, those entities are the glass of water is what is appropriate in the context of academic seminar, and the glass of whiskey is what is not appropriate and which is appropriate in the bar or the party and so on. Do you think that these two views are strict opponents, that they can't combine together in our everyday lives, whether in the United States and Russia and China and well, in every cultural part of the world? The second question. Okay.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I know. To be honest, I also think about the issue because I discussed with my friends, and we really find it very intuitive, very strong to think about the kind of essential property of water or vodka, etc. Right. It's so essential. It can almost define what it is, as an object. But I would like to give an example, like in biology. Like the kind of similar thinking we go into the domain of inquiry in molecular biology, for example. Right? We try to find the kind of DNA, etc., like oncogene, etc. And then it's responsible for causing cancer. That kind of line of thinking, I think, is rooted in a similar way of thinking, that it inherits from chemistry and physics. And so we are working with our colleagues in molecular biology and Professor Chai. And he comes from this industry, hardcore science. And he is critical of this idea because think about the oncogene when it causes cancer. Right? The temporal scale it takes like 30 years or 40 years, etc. So in what sense we can say that the oncogene is the cause of cancer? Right? So I mean, that's one example. So I mean, when we think about the issue this way, it might serve to undermine our intuition that's trying to say something like an essential property that the chemical structure of the material is so crucial for what we concern when we are dealing with reality. So anyway, so I think to some extent, the kind of essential property of object, such as its chemical component, I think is important, it's relevant, but I would suggest following the insight of the Confucian or Taoist ideas that we should look at a broader background. Mm-hmm. I think that's something, it's a point of emphasis, I think. And eventually, maybe this true approach to the study of an object might not be in contradiction to one another. But I think we should be careful of how much emphasis we stick to one particular perspective. Again, that's Zhuangzi's suggestion. Mm-hmm. We can do things two different ways, or many different ways. And we have to know its limitation. So.
Okay, thank you.
Кратенько переведу. Значит, вопрос, насколько я понимаю, заключался в том, что, допустим, мы можем взять два взгляда на объекты, ну вот, например, стакан воды или там стакан виски, да, то есть стакан воды, состав жидкости, соответственно, одна химическая формула, стакан виски другая химическая формула, и, соответственно, это будет эссенциалистский подход, тогда как контекстуалистский подход будет скорее рассматривать, насколько уместен стакан воды, допустим, вот сейчас на столе, как бы, да, по сравнению со стаканом виски, который был бы здесь в академической среде не совсем уместен, по крайней мере, в текущий момент.
Важное замечание.
Да. И, соответственно, собственно, кратко ответ, значит, что, собственно, мы можем действительно, допустим, когда мы говорим о химическом составе вот, жидкости, мы можем действительно достаточно точно с эссенциалистской точки зрения сказать, что да, вот этот вот объект, эта жидкость состоит из таких-то химических соединений, молекул и так далее. И, соответственно, вот, допустим, можем взять пример, что вот такой-то напиток, соответственно, ведет к возникновению рака. И это, значит, медицинское исследование, которое показывает эту связь. Но, соответственно, если мы рассмотрим эту ситуацию в широком контексте, то мы можем говорить о том, что употребление этой жидкости ведет к возникновению рака спустя там, 40 лет после или больше после, собственно, постоянного употребления, скажем так. Поэтому, соответственно, с одной стороны, с эссенциалистской точки зрения, здесь мы можем говорить о составе этой жидкости и о медицинской доказанности связи, соответственно, потребления этой жидкости и онкологического заболевания, а с другой стороны, в более широком контексте эта связь не такая уж важная в конечном счете может оказаться. Поэтому даже говоря о таких объектах, вот, которые могут быть легко определены как реальные, соответственно, вот профессор Чэн говорит о том, что, тем не менее, он предпочитает значит, вот, восточный, значит, подход, который говорит о рассмотрении любой вещи вне зависимости от в широком контексте, а не только как, соответственно, ее физической, там, допустим, сущности.
Can I ask the second question? Okay, my second question refers to your position of Daoist approach to personal identity with the Lockean. It's better to say opposition of the Lockean approach to identity with Daoist one. When we stand on the Lockean ground, we say that the person is identical while he or she identifies its own memory, while he or she remembers himself or herself in the past. And as you said, the Daoist approach is the approach of making a judgment. If I make a judgment that I'm the same person as 5 years ago, then I am. But my objection is that if we have a person with some mental issues, like the split of personality, or like, well, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in the famous Stevenson's novel, I think that both approaches fail, either Lockean or Daoist. Then we can't identify a person standing on either one of them.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, that's a very good phenomenon you mentioned about these mentally dysfunctional people, that they fail their memory, consciousness, etc., but somehow they remain the same person, etc. So I think Johnston's view will fail because it will be dependent upon his judgment about what kind of person he is, and his judgment does not function, etc. So that in my classification, it falls under the Confucian model more. And the Taoist, as I try to say, there are two ways of developing it. One can develop into more Confucian model, by saying that it's the judgment that determines who I am. But another is not on the judgment or narrative, that kind of scenario. It will be giving a more radical reading that focuses on the background condition that makes making judgment possible, right? So the mentally dysfunctional person, they might not be able to make judgments, that they still have other conditions that make them function as a sort of a person, etc. So I think a more radical reading of the Taoist, as I try to develop in the last part, could accommodate this phenomenon.
Ну, значит, вопрос заключался в том, насколько, соответственно, вот если мы возьмем, допустим, человека, который, собственно, с психическими проблемами, да, который, соответственно, допустим, у него там множественное личностное расстройство или, соответственно, какая-то амнезия и так далее, то здесь для определения его идентичности не работает ни локовский подход, ни даосистский подход, который предполагает делание умозаключения относительно того, являюсь ли я той же личностью, которой был раньше. Соответственно, вот психически больные люди могут быть не в состоянии делать таким умозаключением. Но, соответственно, вот ответ заключался в том, что в таких случаях предпочтительным все-таки является некая радикальная версия даосистского подхода, поскольку, соответственно, даже при отсутствии возможности делать умозаключение можно говорить о неком понимании себя как личности, скажем так.
So my third question may refer to both today's speakers, and it's very short. Do you think that the conceptual tools of the nowadays Western philosophy, like say analytical philosophy, fit with the Chinese ontologies? Do you think that the nowadays analytical philosophy can capture the specialities of Chinese ontology?
Okay, I go first, and then Professor Chэн. So I think in my own experience, analytic philosophy is, I think, its strength is its conceptual analytic tools. That is very powerful, and so as a conceptual tool is very useful to reconstruct Chinese philosophical ideas. And of course, when we are doing this, we have to be very careful not to impose the analytic philosophical views onto philosophical Chinese traditions, right? And I think we can try to prevent that from happening because we are able to read the Chinese classics directly, and we grow up in that culture, so we have a direct sense of what's going on there, hopefully. And there, as I said, in the analytic tradition, of course, there are a variety of different views. So that's why I try to point out here. People like Johnston and Schechtman, their views are really more Asian, even though they might not look at it that way. So I seem to come in from a kind of anthropological, that kind of research to say that, look, their work, especially Johnston, is kind of ignored by his colleagues, because that's my diagnosis, because they don't know how to deal with him, with his philosophy, because he really removed himself from the kind of framework, from the presuppositions that they share in common. That's my diagnosis. So I'm trying to say that the analytic philosophy, some of them, I think, can capture Chinese philosophy, that they work. So this kind of cross-cultural tradition study, I think, really can be helpful, and can be helpful also. Let me add this one more point: to develop new models of personal identity that might not be so easily come up in their tradition.
If I understand you right, correctly, then you say that in general it is possible that the Western analytical philosophy with its conceptual tools can capture the specialities of Chinese ontologies, but we need an opinion of experts like you, for instance, to judge whether it's successful or not.
To tell the truth, right? Yeah. Well, I would not say we are experts in a way. But to be honest, we are not the real experts of Chinese philosophy. But I think that's part of the strength of our training, which is that we know the professional standards. So we'll present our work in front of the real experts. So in Taiwan and internationally, we'll present our work to our colleagues. And some of them are very traditional, conservative, say that we are impure or something like that. It's fine. But some others, they could be very open and saying that Chinese philosophy will welcome as much input, resources as possible that will only benefit Chinese philosophy. So I think it's good for and important for real Chinese philosophy experts to check on the work. But the real Chinese philosophy experts, actually, there is not only one school. It has to be consisting of a variety of different approaches. Right? And I think that is what's going on now.
For my case is that, to me, Western philosophy of science provide a very good toolbox for us. For example, when I first read Jin Yueling's ontologies, that is not quite that clear to me. But once and one day, Kai reminded me, say that the Julian's ideas on efficacy and the idea of she, is quite similar to Nancy Cartwright's idea of causal structures. Then I go back to read Cartwright's works and then reread Jing Yueling's works. Then I finally find out that then I understand what Jing says about situation and process. So this case indicates that probably Western approach can help to articulate what Chinese philosophy said. Yeah.
Thank you.
Ну, кратко, значит, содержание дискуссии. Значит, последний вопрос заключался в том, что, ну, собственно, насколько полезны, да, и могут быть полезны, соответственно, западные методологии, в частности, аналитической философии, для решения вопросов, проблем восточных онтологий, вообще восточной традиции философской. Соответственно, первый ответ заключался в том, что, соответственно, аналитическая философия, в частности, достаточно различные есть подходы. Некоторые из них, как вот было представлено в докладе, могут быть близки к восточному, соответственно, к восточным онтологиям, к восточному пониманию, ну, китайскому в частности. Но, соответственно, для того, чтобы, ну, в каком-то смысле, для того, чтобы понять, где применение таких онтологий, таких методологий западных адекватно, китайской философской традиции, хорошо иметь возможность читать китайскую философию напрямую, китайские тексты читать напрямую, то есть, соответственно, их понимать, как они есть сами по себе. И второй ответ, соответственно, заключался в том, что западная философия науки может рассматриваться как хороший инструмент для понимания некоторых восточных, китайских, в частности, вот, онтологических концепций, как вот было на примере, соответственно, работы Нэнси Картрайт и вот этой концепции вещей в процессе, концепции Ши, значит, соответственно, вот в китайской философии, где, собственно, вот как раз западная методология позволила более точно понять какие-то идеи восточной традиции. And I would also add that I had heard an opinion by some of the Chinese colleagues who say that there is no way to understand the Chinese philosophy if you don't read Chinese. Do you agree with it, or is it possible for us who do not read the Chinese language to understand the concepts of Chinese philosophy correctly, so to say?
So, I mean, of course, it's always good or better to know the original language. It's just like if you don't read Greek or Latin, etc., you create some kind of obstacle distance to get really into the
thick of things.
But it really, but I think if you depending really relative to your needs. I mean, I mean there are many good scholarly work, let's say on Chinese philosophy, that we can read and really to get the ideas of what the Chinese philosophy is about, and that could serve to give us some insights when we are doing our own work, which might not reside in Chinese philosophy. So I think it's not necessary.
It's possible.
It's possible.
Yeah.
I think it's possible.
So I think you were quoting the Zipporin.
Zipporin.
Yeah, and you were quoting Julien, who's also Western, both are Western researchers who are doing the work on Chinese philosophy.
Yeah, their work really inspire me to think about, to understand Chinese philosophy.
Yeah. So you think that they have understood the basics?
I think so.
Yeah.
They are very good. And Zipporin is really brilliant. Mm-hmm. And his reading of the Confucian text is very different from how I will read it as a native Chinese speaker. He will read it with the Western educational background with this idea of identity and difference in the Western tradition. And then he approached the text, which might be talking about ethical issues. But then he will read metaphysical ideas about identity and difference in the text. So his reading is very creative. So that's, in that sense, that helps people who do not really read Chinese directly, such as me. Even, yeah.
So these authors are kind of like the bridge between those who native Chinese readers and speakers and philosophers who do not read, but who are interested in Chinese philosophical ideas, and that's nice.
Yeah.
Вопросы еще есть, коллеги? Вопросов нет. Okay, so that was great, and we were all enlightened, and we got together with our Western, Chinese, and Russian traditions together for better mutual understanding. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Спасибо.
So, yes. So, three of us.